on the internet watching this. Thank you for everybody for joining us. We just finished our executive session, and now we are convened back in open session. So item number 2 today is present. We just do 2 and then 3, huh? So Jim has the short straw. He gets to go first. Jim Rounds, welcome for an economic forecast presentation. We appreciate you being here. And one of my board members, Bill Gates, is on, and he's joining us as well. So you have a full complement of supervisors you need to impress.
Outstanding. I forgot it was a informal meeting, so I wore a tie.
Supervisor Gallardo has said the bar is not that high for you today. What is that? No esteem problems here, Steve.
Well, as an economist, that makes sense, so that's all right. I take no offense. I put together a few extra slides that there was some interest in that I heard from some folks. There's some slides on economic or construction activity in different categories. I'm going to go through some of those just really quick because there was the most interest in talking about labor and then also about housing and what's happening and if it's going to impact the budget, things like that. So we'll go through the economic forecast. Maybe. There we go. I'm just going to use the keys. It's all right. So we'll cover the overall economic conditions, national and local, like we normally do, some development activity, special topics. I want to talk about water and housing a bit. Some things have been reported well. I think we've been hearing a lot of misinformation in other categories. I don't think people are intentionally manipulating the stories. I think it's just complicated, and we have a lot of people opining in different areas, and they're really not all that knowledgeable. So hopefully we can clarify a few items, and if anything, if there's any questions that still remain, you can always, send them our way, and we can send you a little report on any areas that you think are deficient or any areas that an economist normally wouldn't cover. But again, the bar is low, so I expect follow-up questions later. And then we can talk about what happened with the forecast. So national economy, the question was whether or not we were going to go into a recession, which is one of the primary things to consider when you look at your forecasts going out a couple or 3 years. This really doesn't look like an economy that's going to be going into a recession right away. There was a lot of debate about those 2 quarters of decline. That was important about 30 years ago. Even when I was in school studying economics, 2 quarters of decline wasn't the definition of a recession. You have to look at a lot of variables. And we had a very unusual recovery, so I feel like we still have some momentum going. A lot of economists over the last 6 months or so were saying we're going to have a recession this year. We were saying it was going to be next year, but it's something to pay attention to. You really don't have a recession when you have a lot of money in the economy and you have a lot of government spending. That's what's going to buoy it, and we basically still have both, even though we've seen some interest rate increases. Take a look at U.S. employment. Yes, we've been increasing. If you draw a line just on the right side, it looks like it's growing quite a bit. We exceeded where we were during the COVID, the peak right before COVID, but we still haven't hit the long-term trend. So the U.S. is growing. It's recovered the lost jobs, but we're adding an okay amount. This isn't some massively impressive economic expansion, but there are some statistics that you want to look at. And even though there's hundreds of data points out there on employment and income and all these others, really if you look at 2 or 3, you can get a good idea where things are going and kind of a rule of thumb on what to look for. When you take a look at the percent change, we're still looking at okay job growth. My rule of thumb, percentages are often displayed. My rule of thumb at the U.S. level is if you're in the middle end, the middle of a expansion, you want to have 250 to 300,000 jobs created each month. If you see that number, that's good. Now, in the articles, you'll hear, well, the forecast was for 400,000 and we only produced 350. And like I've said before, that just means it was a bad forecast. But if it's in that 250 to 300 range, it's good. This far into an expansion where we're probably going to be hitting a mild recession next year, you want to look for about 200,000. We've been realizing on average about 300,000 the last couple or 3 quarters. So we're still in that point where there's enough money circulating through the economy. There's still enough jobs. And it's going to be a different kind of a downturn when we have it, and I'll cover that. The biggest thing that happened, and we showed you this last time, is the federal government was expecting a downturn to look more like what we saw in the Great Recession, which was a deep recession and over a long period of time. That's what was realized. So we had public policy that was designed more like this. We had the economy performing more like this. So what ended up happening? We had lots of easy money in the economy. Here's where the stories can be a little bit misleading. So this was from Fool.com, so the old Motley Fool. Since hitting an all-time high of 22 trillion in July 22, M2 has now declined by 5%, the biggest drop since 1933. That means money's being pulled out of the economy, so the interest rates went up, and then you start siphoning money out of the economy. You can put money into the economy or take it out by buying or selling bonds. This seems like it's a big deal and it's going to stall the economy. That's the 5% decline on the far right. We went through a 50% increase before that. So you have to look at some of the history. If all you do is you look at that 5% decline and you're concerned, that tells you one thing. If you look at what we need to do to get back to normal, we still need to siphon more money out of the economy. So I'm not concerned about some of the stories about us being too aggressive taking it out. I'm concerned if we can continue to raise interest rates much more than what we're at now. We're actually at that threshold where you can get in a difficult position economic-wise if you go up too much more. So we're kind of getting to that range. So I think the majority of the activity is going to be taking money out of the economy. We had a federal funds rate that was very, very low. Again, it was a lot of money circulating. It was basically free to access, and we had a lot of government spending. That's going to buoy everybody's budget. That buoyed the county's budget, but you all were aware of how that happened, and I remember even a couple of years ago, we were doing calculations on to what extent might this extra spending be adding to the current base so that you can say, well, that might not continue, and that was factored into it. That wasn't really done at the state level. There were no formal calculations at the state level for how much of the current budget might be temporary because of this activity, which was a little disappointing. So I was feeling a little obnoxious one day, and I went ahead and did the calculation myself and tweeted about it a little bit and had a little fun. But it was about $500 million to $1 billion in the current base that is going to go away when things go down too far in terms of the government spending. I don't think the government spending is going to be cut back anytime soon. And part of the government spending has to do with where it's spent. We're seeing a lot of money going to infrastructure projects. But keep in mind, the federal government isn't doing the projects. The federal government is shoving the money out the door. We're having to do the projects, or you all are having to do the projects. Others are having to do the projects. So we'll have to see how efficient we are about putting the extra infrastructure in place, how we're going to use it to get that positive return on investment later. And again, a lot of my conservative colleagues don't like the fact that we're trying to get some money from the federal government. That money came out of my wallet, came out of your wallets, it came out of everybody else's wallets already. I want to get it back for Arizona. CPI, we're not seeing growth at the same level, but what does CPI actually mean? It just means that the cost of things isn't growing as much. We all know that the cost is very high in a lot of categories. Even if it was at zero, it doesn't mean prices are coming down. So even though inflation isn't going up as much, the prices are still very high. It's still hitting consumers quite a bit. It would have to go negative in order for us to get back to how we normally were. We're probably going to see a period of extended low interest eventually, and at some point we'll catch up to the trend, but prices are going to be high for a little while longer. Usually in these types of situations, economists call it sticky up, where you have a lot of the data goes up, costs go up, inflation, things like that. It kind of sticks up at a higher level until it comes back down. Leading index starting to slide a little bit. Let's talk about the local economy. Jobs, obviously, you want to look at as one of your main categories. Job growth by state in 2022, Nevada was number 1, Arizona was number 18. I've been asked a number of times to try to explain, what is Nevada doing so well and we're doing so poorly? Nothing. It means that they fell far during the downturn. They didn't recover until very late. And when you start to recover, you post stronger rates of growth, and then you get back down to normal. Arizona and the greater Phoenix area in Maricopa County didn't fall as far, and we started recovering earlier. So we're back down to more normal rates of growth when a lot of other states are now catching up. So like Hawaii, aside from the terrible thing that happened in Maui, very weak economy, tourism based, but still very weak, very poor state. They're number 10. It has to do with timing, and so you got to be really careful when you look at rankings. Everybody loves rankings. I like rankings, but you can only rely on them in normal periods, so you can't rely on them in times like what we're going through right now. 2023, we fell to 32. Is that going to be a problem? It's the same kind of story. I'm expecting us to probably be more in the top 5 after the next recession. I think we'll be top 5 in most economic categories. But I also like to look at the percent recovery by state from COVID. So we're still top 10 in that. Idaho, as I joke all the time, you add a Circle K, you double the employment base, so you have a high rate of growth. Texas performing at really high rates of growth is incredible, just given their size. But we'll be okay. It's just we went through an unusual downturn, an unusual expansion, and so the stats don't tell us what they normally do. Historically, we always outperform the U.S. as a whole. Right now, the reason I put a question mark on the far right is that we are going through that period where some of the other states are catching up, and that's pushing up the U.S. average a little bit, but it doesn't mean we're going to be doing worse than the U.S. It just means we did better earlier. I really like this. This is a result of people like the group that's going to talk after me, GPEC and Chris, a lot of the work that they've been doing and other economic development groups. We've always done a great job of recruiting jobs, recruited people. Before, decades ago, we did a great job of creating high-wage jobs. That went away for a little bit. Now we're starting to see increases in some of the measures like per capita personal income. And so the question is that going to start to curve back up? When you have higher wage jobs, not only do you have more spin-off jobs, but you have individuals that can take care of themselves. They pay more in taxes. You can invest in the right ways. You could have competitive tax rates and money to put into different programs that help people move forward. So this, for me, was the most important overall general slide that I have, because I'm optimistic that we're starting to see per capita personal income as a percentage of the U.S. move up. Been waiting for this for a while. Housing affordability, yes, people are spending on average more of their income on housing, but unfortunately, when you look at it in general, it doesn't really tell you the extent that certain groups are being hit particularly hard. So lower income groups are being penalized for a lot of things that were out of their control. Obviously, we had to go through a period where we overproduced right before the Great Recession, then we underproduced for a while. Then we went through a period where we had financial constraints on development. A lot of people blame the cities. A lot of the situation had to do with basic finance. It didn't have to do with necessarily changes in the way building permits were issued and what the requirements were. But that was part of it, though. And so we've done a lot of work with cities to explain to them when they might want to convert some land over into multifamily, and we do the math to show it. And then we've also worked on the other side. So we've worked with the cities and we've worked with the home builders, and the cities didn't change their policy as much as the financial situation's changed, which is going to require the cities to become more flexible. The question is whether or not we want to have this kind of stuff imposed at the state level. We were very much opposed to some of the measures that were being suggested for the cities, because we thought that the education process, trying to get them to commit to being a little bit more aggressive, like whether or not the neighborhood next to you has a beige theme and the one that's being proposed has a gray theme, come on, that shouldn't be part of the evaluation. The roof pitch doesn't matter in Arizona. It barely ever rains. if you have a steep roof pitch, you're requiring a steeper roof pitch in some developments because they think it looks cool. We don't need that kind of stuff. But there are cases where you have to try to look at safety issues. Or in some developments, the developer has to put in the street lighting where the city wasn't going to. And then you have those street lights that are required. There's a story for everything. Unfortunately, the stories were being told by two groups that were very much on different sides of the argument. But since the legislation failed, the next step for the League of Cities and the cities themselves is, one, we're going to work with them a little bit and go through how we do projects and how we evaluate whether or not something would be good multifamily or maybe it wouldn't. And then if we can give them a template for maybe a checklist on what they go through, yes, we'll be hired for fewer projects, but they'll be approving things more quickly. We need to do a lot of stuff like that. We need to be hands-on. A lot of changes have to happen, but both sides were right and both sides were a little bit wrong. Housing affordability, still very weak. Of course, if you locked in at a very low interest rate, you're doing well, but you're not going to be you're going to be keeping that house for a long time. Given that, I think the last statistic I saw yesterday was something like at the trough of interest rates versus where it is now, the payment for the same price home is like a $500,000, $600,000 home. It was like $2,400 versus $1,400 or something like that. That's a big difference. You need a lot of extra income to make up that difference. So these are real issues. So we're going to have to figure out how to change it. But as policymakers, and you already know this, you don't want to put in permanent policy changes for temporary economic conditions. I'm afraid in this case, we're going to have housing affordability problems for a little while. So I think we'll have to implement different things to try to become more efficient. And that's a whole separate presentation. But if you ever want to do brainstorming on county's role and maybe how you could assist the cities and the state or whatever you would like to do, let me know and we can at least brief you on. We did 3 reports on it. You can have those ahead of time. Just read the executive summary. No one reads the full report from an economist, but the executive summaries are short and sweet. And then if you want to come up with something on that, be happy to brainstorm with you. Median prices of homes sold, yes, they've come down a little bit, still very high. I'm going to skip this. The reason I put this together is because it was in a report and basically showed there's a lot of different impacts on what happened with home prices, homes not being affordable. There's a lot of different things going on, and a lot of things on this we don't have control over. But we have to identify what do we control, and do we want to control it as a government entity, and then what would your tasks be? How would you coordinate with others? I'm going to skip through the development activity to free up some time. Workforce supply. There's a lot we could talk about this as well. In fact, maybe there's a separate meeting with your chiefs or something like that to give them a briefing on housing and then maybe workforce as well, if you'd like. But I've been using this in a few speeches because I'm trying to reduce it to the absurd. So I call it the bumper case studies, bumper sticker case studies. Arizona, let's just be average. This is if we became average with the US. So with higher ed, because we did some work for the universities and the business community on what would happen if we started catching up to the averages on educational attainment and we had that extra workforce out there supplying the people that we need for a lot of these businesses. We'd have an extra $500 million in statewide tax revenues every year. This is catching up with the average. Again, if we're average, we have $500 million more to spend every year to try to get to that point. This is how you do your ROI calculations. You calculate what the benefit's going to be, you look at the cost, and if it's a positive ROI, if you were a business, you would have made the investment. If you're government, this is where, depending on the flow of funds, this is where you would consider making an investment. Environmental technology. Again, like I talked about it a number of times, this isn't about hugging trees. This is about doing the R&D. This is about doing the manufacturing in a lot of different cases. There's a lot of grant money that's coming back to the state related to things like the closing the coal-fired power plants up north, which we're working on. How do you redesign the economy? It's everywhere. So what would happen if all we did was catch up with the US average on our portion of green jobs? We have fewer green jobs per capita than the US as a whole. If we caught up to the average, we'd have almost 250 million more in tax revenues. I think we can exceed the US average. I was shocked to see that we were below the US average in the latest formal data that's out. We should be able to exceed that. So all of a sudden we have another $500 million in revenue. 2 policy topics that should be easy to implement. has $1 billion in annual extra tax revenue, to the highest ROI calculations that we've ever done. This shows that we can do stuff, but we have to identify specific tasks. I've been in a number of meetings, and Chris will, be able to confirm this. There's a lot of meetings, hundreds of them every year, probably even 1,000, where people talk about what are we going to do about workforce? What are we going to do about housing? What are we going to do about this item? They're never specific. It's, well, we're going to work harder. We're going to have enough workers so that it satisfies the demand for the next 10 years. What are you going to do? Well, we might need to invest more in K-12 and in the universities and private sector and things like that. How? Well, that was beyond the scope. We have to get specific. I believe that we can think about these things at a high level and have that discussion starting, but we have to have specific assignments. If you're not specific, nothing gets done in government. You can generalize, it sounds really good, but been working with you all for a long time. I feel one thing that I really believe in is that the county supervisors can have a bigger role in terms of the impact on the economy in a lot of these different cases. Even if you don't have direct influence on a particular area, you're leaders. I'm a small, irrelevant economic consultant, yet we can write an op-ed piece and it might derail a bad piece of legislation at the Capitol. Can you imagine what you all could do if we could somehow tie your work with even the IDA that I'm on, with Jack's appointment, and some of the other economic groups? Again, you don't have to be an economic developer. That doesn't have to be your primary role. But as a leader, you understand how the economy works better than most policymakers that I've worked with. I'd love to see that elevated this coming year. I feel like maybe a 2 or 3 year plan to elevate that would work wonders. I think it would have a huge impact on the economy here, much more than you might realize.
Well, let me questions. Let me ask a question about that. Mm-hmm. You've been working with us for a long time. You're on IDA, and you see what we try to accomplish as supervisors, Jim. So give me an example of a space that we can walk into. I'm looking at my vice chair here that continues to try to lead all the way through this with this Prop 400 extension. I mean, he was vocal. He got out there. And now we have a Prop 400 extension that at some point we're going to be voting to go to the voter. But we were trying to enter that space, but there are other times where we're trying to enter a space and to show what we do, some of the wisdom that we have amassed working with our communities, businesses, development, and I don't know if we have the voice sometimes that should be recognized. Sometimes it's slapped down by other people that serve in elected positions. So give me an example right now in this space and in this environment where guys like us can walk in and have an impact. We all think we have that ability too, but there are certain times I attend mayors and managers meetings sometimes, and it's like, oh yeah, let's hear from the supervisor. Okay, how can you help us with this legislature? You tell me. So where's the space? You've been with us a long time. Where's the space?
The space is the same as mine. When you go into a meeting, if you have more knowledge on a topic than anybody else, you're going to have more influence in that meeting than anybody else. I think one of the keys would be to figure out where you want to have some of that influence. One thing that I've already been trying to tee up with the IDA is I would like to see IDA staff have, and it might include adding an extra person, consultant, whatever it is, I would like to see staff coordinate with the board more. I was president the last 2 years. My second term just ended. But I remember the prior year, we set up a meeting with the board, and everybody thought that was really fun, and it was kind of a chance to brainstorm. But what would happen if on some of the topics, because the IDA has to look at economic topics as well because we fund different projects, but we're funding projects that produce a positive ROI that we spend our money basically. Well, even though it's not considered public money, I always view it as public money because it's a public institution. That has benefits for the county. our ROI calculations are, does the county make more money than what we're spending? So there is definitely an economic connection, but I would like to see some of that extra analysis and have you all involved in, not necessarily saying we want this project, but have you briefed on, here's some of the bigger things that we're doing, here's some of the smaller things we're doing. It might have a direct impact in one of your districts, but in general, as a governing board, it has an impact on the county and even as a state. And as a leader within the state, I think it's important to be knowledgeable in a lot of these areas. I think the key is to maybe identify what are the main things that you want to have an influence on? Because you can't be an expert in everything, otherwise you're an expert in nothing. But a few key areas. And if we can combine some of that IDA research and have that liaison also be your economic liaison, we do your forecasting. GPEC does a lot of the business recruitment. I think all it's missing is that coordinator that can chat with your chiefs, that can chat with staff, with others. And it doesn't have to be, you know, writing dissertations all the time. I think some of it's just coordination and keeping in the loop on stuff. That's why I give a bunch of speeches. I do a lot of interviews. I attend a lot of meetings, because you become knowledgeable in certain areas and you figure out where you want to go deeper in terms of your knowledge. And I can picture, like, let's say that you were going to ask whoever that liaison is, or even ask us. You're still welcome to call anytime, and we you know, communicate on occasion, or and visit and talk about policy. But if it's something that you're coming up with, if you're going to be attending a conference on housing, get lunch and brainstorm. It's like, here's 30 data points, here's some perspective on it. I could say, remember those 4 slides on housing from the presentation? Here's the other 20 that I can't put in a PowerPoint because it would take the meeting too long. Having that information is a key. Having that, being that person that goes in and has answers, or can help coordinate and work with the people that have answers, that's the best part. That's not going to keep you up at night, but it's when you get up in the morning, you'll be excited about the work.
Chris, be prepared to go into that with your presentation as well. Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, just real quickly, and now, since it was brought up, appreciate everything. It's always eye-opener, and I'm not an economist. I don't try to pretend to be one. It's for folks like yourselves, you're the experts that come to try to kind of shed light. That's when I say, when the bar's not high to impress the board here, you know, at least for me. But nonetheless, I appreciate it. You brought up the IDA, and I couldn't agree with you more. I'll be honest. I'm just going to say this in hopes that folks are listening. And I think I've probably been probably one of the biggest critics of our IDA on this board. I think the relationship between this board and the IDA has fallen through cracks over the last few years. I think there should be stronger communications. I don't remember over the last, been here going on 10 years, probably been 8 or 9 years that anyone from the IDA has ever called my office or even spoke to me. And I've been here, I don't know about the other gentlemen that are a little bit, haven't been on the board maybe that long, but it's been like almost 9 years. And I think that has to be fixed. It really has, because I think you're right. I think the IDA is such a strong tool that can be utilized to do so much. But it has to be a partnership. We got to be working together. And so I applaud you. I appreciate. Thank you for serving on our IDA. But it's broken, and it has to be fixed. Anywhere from, and I'm not even going through the makeup of the board. I mean, my district was left out and not represented. But nonetheless, I do agree with you. That has to change. The leadership of the IDA has to work with this board. And it's not there. Maybe maybe my colleagues are having that type of relationship, but I'm not. I couldn't tell you. Again, I can't. It's just so frustrating. Nonetheless, throw that out there. I do agree with you on, I believe our board can do so much more in terms of a lot of what you pointed out. And I've always said this, you know, one of my colleagues that no longer on the board, past colleague, told me one time, I threw an idea. He said, "Oh, Steve, that's a city issue." No, it's not. Their constituency is our constituency. Their issues are our issues. We should be working together. It's a partnership. And I look at my district and I say, how do I help my kids, my community, my young students have that pathway to college? And unless, as a supervisor, I look at it not so much from an education. You know, that's a whole nother debate. Are schools underfunded? Are universities underfunded? That's a whole nother debate that the legislature needs to be having. I think we need to be engaged in it. But I think as me sitting in this seat, what can I do? And I strongly believe I can work to address the social and economic challenges these kids face every day off campus, in their homes. That's where I can serve a strong role. And that's what I do. I mean, I spend probably 90% of my time focused on that. How do I address those social and economic challenges that these kids face every day that's hampering their education or their possibility of going to a college or any type of in-state university or community college, whatever. How can I address that? So I agree with you. I think there's so much we can do. We're the fourth largest county in the country. And at times I just feel as we're not. And there's something, I'm not being critical. I'm not being critical because it's every district's issue or every district's different challenges, different issues. But I think there's so much more I can be doing in District 5. I think the fact that we are not a charter government is another, I guess, I don't know what you call it. Disadvantage, there's a good word. I think we should. I think we need to separate ourselves, not so much separate ourselves, but have the ability to govern the way we believe Maricopa County should be governed. The fact that we have to go to the legislature and ask for permission, let it be Prop 400, let it be whatever, I think is holding back our ability to really govern, work with municipalities. There's so much. And when every time, I got to go, the legislature, and I get it. That's just the way it's set up. But I think folks need to understand that we, as supervisors, need a little bit more latitude. And the only way to do it is, I believe, through a charter system.
Jim, let me,
yeah,
because this is tough on as a board member, but let me just answer. You know, we have made some changes, Steve, as you know. We heard you. The board heard you. And I think.
Oh, the IDA?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
We're starting to make some changes.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
And I also know that Jen and I have talked about it. Shelby is going to be making a presentation soon to this board. Because I heard you with that too. And I think a lot of us, you know, some of us new, some of us have been here, have expectations, you know, based on the tradition of it, the partnerships. Who we appoint to these boards to represent us, how often we stay in contact with our own appointments. But I'm hearing you too. It's just that's going to be all that is going to be really hard for you to answer, Jim. So I'm going to say let's finish up the presentation.
I was trying to make a comment that other people were listening. You know, you opened the door, I went through it. All right.
Let me just say this really quick, Steve. So. Here's an example. We were going to be doing some work for a local organization that was going to be looking at some inconsistencies with foster kids being taken out of their homes. It's disproportionate to what you would expect with Black communities. Hispanic communities, that's the biggest volume. That's a project that I wanted to take on. We were also contacted by the United Way to see if we wanted to do some work that might have an impact on some legislation. So what I'd do is I'm going to see if I can combine this effort. We can be their economic advisor, monetize some of these benefits, show what would happen if we not just help the kids, but we help the parents, and that it'll pay for the project 10 times over, and that money can be used for other things, and then Republicans and Democrats at the state vote for it. If that was an area that's of interest to you, maybe you should be in one of the meetings with me. But you'd have to be informed that that kind of stuff goes on. This isn't what I do. I don't just do welfare stuff, but this is important. It has an economic impact, but you first have to be knowledgeable of it. And so that's what I'm thinking, if maybe there's even a way of doing some briefings on some hot topics. And there's different ones, like that environmental tech stuff. I can go on for for a year talking about the economic benefits, but people are going to have to make some tough decisions. There's a lot of those types of topics out there, and maybe let's continue to address that, because I feel like there's ways where if you don't know what you don't know, but if you know that there's an effort in a particular area and you want to have involvement, then you figure out what would be a great way of being a leader in that category. It could be workforce. It could be with a lot of different things. It could be with transportation. But there's enough out there where I like that topic. I just have a feeling, based on what I know of you, that would be something that you'd want to participate in. Why wouldn't you be at one of those meetings? But you just have to be informed. Maybe being informed on some of the bigger policy topics through some coordination could be something we could do. But maybe we can work with staff, your own staff, and see the IDA staff, and see if we can come up maybe with a little bit of a plan for, let's kick this into overdrive and not only increase the connection with the IDA, but also how can we establish it where you're put in the best position to try to do good using your leadership position and, quite frankly, your knowledge in a lot of areas. I've talked to all of you before, and you're experts in different areas, and there's a lot of overlap. You'll be able to team up on things. I feel like you could do a lot of good.
I think, and Mr. Chairman, just throw right back on top of that, because you're hitting a soft spot here for me. Bringing in, and I'm a strong believer, it takes a village. It does. When you look at some of these issues, it does take a village. And when I say a village, it's not only the private sector nonprofits, it's the business community, it's the faith community, it's everyone coming together to have these discussions, and how do you address them? And I couldn't agree more. I think our economy, our state will be so much stronger if we start looking at them, having these types of dialogue. Pull all the partisan bullshit aside and ignore that stuff, but really start to look. And I have a little brother from the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. He's going to turn 21. I've had him since, we were partnered up since he was 6 or 7. Foster care kid. If I get him in my car, he can drive around and he can point out all the different group homes and foster care homes just in Levine alone. He can say, oh, go in. Yeah, that's where so-and-so lives, so-and-so, and he knows where they're at. There's hundreds of them, these kids, and I think the last count was nearly 16,000 in the state of kids that just have a tough road ahead.
Jim, I'm going to ask you to hit some hot spots with your remaining presentation. We kind of sidetracked you, and you brought up some great points that we need to talk to you about. So what else would you like us to know in the presentation?
So the main change to the forecast was adjusting for the prior year's actuals, which were strong. And remember, we still had a lot of that government spending and money in the economy, so government collections have been buoyed a little bit more than when they're going to stabilize, but that's going to ramp down slowly, so I don't expect a shock. And your staff have already been using the appropriate forecast. You've already been making excellent decisions on your projections and what you're planning on spending. Again, the best that we've worked with. One of the biggest things will be that we're not going to see as many job losses this downturn. I keep calling it the job posting recession, because we've been short of labor in so many categories. That restaurant that normally would have laid somebody off is just going to take that help wanted sign out the window. So we might have our first downturn in Arizona where we actually lost no jobs. We've had one where we lost very few. But that doesn't mean that everybody's in great financial shape. Everybody got hit differently during the COVID recession and have had a different experience going forward. But there's ways of doing it. There's ways where you want to spend money on a program to help individuals. There's ways where you want to put resources into a program so individuals can help themselves. And then there's economic development policies, so you're generating the revenue to make everything run. So as long as you keep the economics in mind with the public policy, that's a perfect match. So I'm optimistic, especially about the county.
Good. Bill, I can't see you waving your hand. Do you have anything before we release Mr. Rounds? Oh, let me see if Bill has it.
I do not. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rounds.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Tom.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Jim, thank you. Always appreciate your insight. I have a lot of questions, but I think if I had to choose one, I'm most curious about workforce. And what I'm curious about are the types of people that move to Arizona. I feel like back in maybe '06, '07, people were coming here. Maybe they just heard, hey, go out west, land of opportunity. There's tourism jobs, there's construction jobs. But now that we've had a much more diversified economy over the last 10 and 12 years, thanks to folks like you and Mr. Camacho and I think the previous governor, we're seeing a lot kind of different jobs. Are the people coming out here now, because Arizona is still a growth state, are they coming out here because the jobs are coming here and they're following those jobs, or people coming out here saying, hey, I just want to move to Arizona and let's just see what happens?
I think it's a combination. I think people still want to move to an area that has a more thriving economy. There's more job prospects, even if you don't have a job lined up. When my grandfather brought the family out here from New York back in the 50s, he had a letter from his boss saying, you should hire this guy. And he went to Motorola and gave it to some manager there. And then he got hired and worked there his whole career. So I feel like there's still people that are going to look for opportunities. But then there's businesses that are recruiting a lot. You know, Chris can cover, you know, the workforce demands of TSMC and others. So I feel like one thing that we need to do is we focused for years on making sure that we have competitive taxes. And I even designed some of those programs and we reduced some of the rates. I feel like we're at the point now where it's very competitive. We need additional workforce programs. We need some K-12 programs because that feeds into the where we go from there. We have a lot of people that need direct training, technical training. And so those connections need to be made. The universities and the community colleges historically didn't have the best connections, but they're starting to improve. We have so many needs, and the most basic principle in economics isn't supply and demand, it's productivity. If you increase your productivity, you do better for yourself and your family and your community. So we need to increase productivity now. And when ASU was ramping up its engineering program for a lot of the, you know, chips type businesses coming out, when we did our ROI analysis to help them get that funding for the New Economy Initiative, it was one of the most important projects that we worked on in terms of showing that ROI. So I feel like we still need to focus on all that. The things where I've gotten conflicting feedback, and maybe Chris can expand on that, is those that are saying, we don't have the workers to build the TSMC facility. We need to import everybody. There was an article from a union leader that said, that's not the case. And then I talked to another person and they said, no, it's definitely the case. That when you get conflicting feedback, you don't know what to think, but I'm trying not to put too much on one side or the other. I feel like there's probably stuff we can do better. I'd really like to figure out, because we talked about workforce before, I'd like to figure out maybe what would your strategy be, or what would you and your colleagues' strategy be, the county strategy be, on supporting workforce. Now, you don't have to be directly involved, you don't have to be running education facilities, but there's still things that you can do to help support that. And income issues are a major issue. That's the biggest determinant of how well somebody does. So that has huge ROI implications as well. Even criminal justice reform, there's so many different things that you all can be involved with. I'm already thinking in my head that one thing I'd like to put together as a follow-up is a little memorandum of just some policy topics that I've been hearing that have been tossed around lately that are higher, like bigger picture things like what we talked about here, with some bullets on where I think things are going and where it could go. And maybe it's worthwhile just to read through something like that, a 3 or 4 page document and staff, and just say, okay, I'd like to be involved in this. You know, like Steve, if you want to be involved in that, the foster care issue, we'll get together at a different time and, you know, we'll chat about that because I think you'd be a big asset. But on some of the workforce ones, it's the same thing. But the great thing is that you have access, at least to us who have limited knowledge on some of these things, you have access to GPEC, who are the best in the business at understanding how these things work. You have a lot of resources. Just how do you put those together? And I know you can. I'm kind of excited about where this could be going next couple of years.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, Jim, thank you for the presentation. You know what? I'll leave it up to you. If you want to take a seat there, you want to take a seat up here with us, it's up to you. You and Chris are so interrelated. You probably attend a lot of the same meetings, so you might be able to help each other, you know, with some of these upcoming questions. So stay close. Thanks for addressing us today. I'll call Chris Camacho up. on an economic development presentation. So, Chris, welcome. I want to thank you. If you're just new to this and watching on the internet, I want to thank you. You're always just a cell phone call away from us, and you've always acted that way. So I appreciate it. There might be a lot less questions for you. Not saying anything about you, Mr. Rounds, but Chris, usually we see you up here quite often, and definitely on the phone. So thanks for the instant access, because it's so important to this county. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the Board of Supervisors for the opportunity this morning. Thanks to Supervisor Gates for joining us remotely. As the chairman said, I've enjoyed a long-time partnership here with the county. As much as I would love to hear more from Jim on quantitative tightening and roof pitches, I believe we'll move on and work together on answering these questions. So I do, for the supervisors, have a handful of questions, or excuse me, of slides. I'm going to run through these rather quickly, but I do want to ultimately spend, hopefully, our time kind of walking through the next chapter of this region's economy, because I feel like I've been here for 15 years. I've seen pretty substantive change in our manufacturing base. We're definitely, as I'm coming back from Taiwan, if we want to talk a bit about that, I just landed over the weekend. This market's experiencing extraordinary strides in terms of our manufacturing-based growth. But with that said, there's different externalities or strategies that are going to need to be deployed or addressed as we go forward. And there's numerous things that I think are very different, markedly different from a decade ago in terms of our economic base than what I see going forward. And so I'm going to unpack that a little bit for you. And I promise you I only have a few slides for you today, and then whoops, got real excited there. There we go. All right. So many of you know GPEC, make sure I land on this right, is the entity that attracts quality businesses from around the world.
Chris, 1 second. Hey, Eddie, if you guys are walking out, you're probably trying to go to work. I'll be back. Okay, you'll be back. All right. Very good. Thank you, Chris.
And we really focus on that latter point within our mission statement, which is addressing the greater Phoenix region's competitiveness. And I probably spent more of my hours every week focusing on the what's ahead, and that's everything from water to workforce to infrastructure. How we retool the workforce is going to be really important to Supervisor Galvin's point, which I'll touch on. But all in all, again, I feel very strong and positive about the health and wellness of the current economy. For those of you that were here 15, 20 years ago and went through the Great Recession to where we stand today, much more diverse outcomes in our economic base, from healthcare to manufacturing. There's not the reliance on construction like there once was. I would argue we need to continue to drive the pipeline within the trades exponentially. And that's not just for, roof shingles and installation. It's really around the technical side of capital equipment. And what we're seeing with our semiconductor sector is there's tremendous levels of technical abilities needed to install these $50 to $100 million pieces of equipment from ASML, which is a Dutch company, into TSMC as an example. So one thing too, and I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but I think it's really important, when you hear this argument of ready workforce, I take that a little bit with the realization that for 40 years, we relinquished our position on advanced manufacturing tied to semiconductors. And what I mean by that is majority of the globe's chips that were made over the last 40 years, the most advanced chips have been offshore. And we're importing them for all kinds of good. There's probably 1,000 of them in this room as we speak. And so I'm realist in that I believe it's going to take 20 years for us to retool the true manufacturing base to meet the needs of all of this growth, whether it's IRA driven with clean tech, with electric vehicles, all of the adjacent sectors that are tied to semi. The workforce is very different in those sectors, the emerging sectors, and Jim mentioned clean tech or the photon economy. That economy overall is going to warrant different kinds of skills than what we've had for the last 20 years in the workforce. So we'll talk about some strategies when we've been working with the state, but I couldn't agree with what Jim said more. There needs to be a very coherent and strategic focus on in-demand jobs. yes, we need all jobs, and yes, we need all kinds of workforce, all the workforce prepared. But in my world, I have to make sure we're streamlining those in-demand jobs so there's not that supply-demand mismatch. Okay, so I'll come back to that. So here's the numbers. We're metriced by not only a board of directors, but our public sector partners, of which there are 22. You will see there's a lot of numbers here, but in regards to our threshold, target, and stress metrics, we exceeded many of our contract measures with the stretch metric, and many a contract, which is the minimum we must achieve for our communities and our county partners. You can see the yield in actual 7,700 phase 1 jobs. Again, we only count the phase 1, which is generally your first 12 to 18 months of company commitments. That coincides with the total payroll. You can see the average high wage salary. When Jim and I would run the data on these numbers 12, 15 years ago, those numbers would be 42,000 average wage. So we're seeing almost double now the high wages that are being brought into the valley, which creates, on average, for a manufacturer, just one example, a TSMC job is going to create roughly five or more indirect jobs. So that's really what fuels an economy, is having catalyst economic development projects, because then they yield other professional services, other indirect service jobs, as well as additional manufacturing-based jobs. So in Taiwan, for example, which I'm just realizing it's 1 a.m. in Taiwan now, as I'm coming off the flight, the supply chain base that's in Taiwan to support TSMC, if anyone's ever been to the Hsinchu Park, it is like what's now at Ocotillo down in Chandler around Intel, times about 10. And all of the core suppliers are all in a park or a series of parks. And what I envision, because we've already announced 16 announcements that have gone public that are tied to TSMC directly, several of these newer projects, of which there's about 25 in our pipeline, are tied not only to TSMC, but also to Intel, where they cross-support the supply chain base to both companies. So you can see the very strong post in this year's numbers. Here's a couple just highlights again. Of the 37, you can see here companies like Corning, which are building high-end cable for the telecom sector. BMS, Bristol Myers Squibb, doubling down on a biopharmaceutical facility. Tokyo Electron is a supplier of TSMC. You have TSMC's phase 2, which was their 3 nanometer site. And many others. Ray-Rig Pacific Company, most people don't know them. They're one of the largest companies in the injection molding space. They build all kinds of different plastic products that are contracted with many municipalities as well. And then Zenergy is another company, landed in Mesa recently, which is another clean tech company out of Canada. So these are just a few of the examples of some of the companies that have landed here. You also see the locates across the valley, not uncommon from previous years. You have projects from Buckeye into Queen Creek, Mesa, Chandler, Tempe, up in the northern part of the valley in North Phoenix, right in the heart of downtown, to Tolleson, Avondale. When I first joined GPEC 15 years ago, we saw a pretty strong slant in the Southeast Valley of where the projects landed. And what I'm happy to see is that jobs balance over the last 5 years, it is much more balanced. And historically, it would be about 80% between Phoenix and East Valley, leaving 20% for the west side. Now we're seeing many more over the last several years of projects landing across the west side, and you'll hear many more projects announced here shortly that are going to be landing in Peoria, Surprise, and Buckeye, which we're also excited about, in addition to our current other communities. So this is what the current pipeline looks like, 220 active projects. Again, projects generally take 12 to 18 months to cycle through. The capital investment threshold, $144 billion worth of potential investment. Why does that matter to the county? You're going to collect a lot of construction sales tax and property tax on those dollars invested. Notwithstanding the way that our economy is structured, as Jim and I speak a lot about, when you bring high wage jobs into the valley, the significant level of collections in our state are TPT, or sales tax. So when people have high wages, they have more money to spend. More disposable income yields to higher tax revenues for our communities. And the higher wages, the higher wage base industry companies that have much more of a strength and export characteristic are those kind of employers that are less likely to be vulnerable in a down economy or recession occurrence. So that's why we want to see more of those kind of jobs. So finally, I think I had a slide here. For the regional results, you can see here over the last 5 years, pretty significant levels of payroll, 47,000 new jobs created, high percentage of those being high wage jobs. Average salary overall is 60,000, with our high wage on average right around 78,000. And again, the distinction between those two is all jobs versus those high wage designated jobs, which hit 130% of the county median. So with that said, over the last 5 years, there's been $104 for every dollar return to the county, and that's what we're very prideful of. We've had a request coming to the county for the last several years. This year, it will be $685,941. That, in totality, with our other public sector partners, constitutes about 28% of GPEC's operating revenue on the public side. The remaining balance is private supporters that support our mission. So in large part, you're getting a pretty significant direct return, and you're getting private companies that co-invest at the tune of 2 to 1 to public monies. A couple other quick items that I'll cover. So we were heavily involved in 2809, which is a public infrastructure related to manufacturing bill. This broadened the program cap, which enabled more companies to participate. This is our way we address or band-aid the lack of a TIF, the lack of tax increment financing. So if you leave with nothing else today, I'll share this adage. When we're competing with other places, we're competing with Texas, we're competing with Charlotte, Georgia, et cetera, Tennessee, for these large-scale projects, they expect the communities, the state, the regions to have, quote-unquote, certified sites that are available with public infrastructure, readily available, kind of, again, certified sites, site-ready. And that doesn't just mean the pipes to the site, it means the ample supply of water and wastewater capacity. So what this bill does is it enables cities to invest in the public infrastructure and the water and wastewater, of which are a pretty significant magnitude when you're talking the scale of some of these projects. It allows them to recapture some of those TPT dollars that then pays out down the debt service for those investments that they're making. I would argue we need a broader-based approach to this. I don't know how we're going to continue to compete when we're having the legislature slash some of the city-level revenues, and when we're having to grapple over where to put investment dollars, which are very minimal, from general funds into strategic infrastructure. That's also why it was mentioned Prop 400E, the half-cent transportation sales tax, was critically important. And I don't understand ultimately why this becomes a very tribal argument. The legislature, as many of you know, we're the only region that requires, or only county that requires, a tax increase to go to the legislature first before it gets kicked back to our voters. We did an assessment that 90% of GPEC's locates over the last 20 years have landed within 2 miles of the major transportation corridors in our region. So I can't fathom not having the 101, the 202, the 303, the SR 30 to 24 in the future. I can't fathom how we keep a bottom 6 commute shed without making these investments. So I want to applaud the legislature and the governor's office for getting this done. Many of you were heavily involved in that process. We still have to do the vote, certainly, but critical to economic development is a linkage with transportation. So finally, our strategic plan, here's our pillars, and I just wanted to re-eyeball it for you. So not only do we do the business development work, which many of you know is the trailing indicator of our work, I would argue the work we do around leading an ambitious strategy for the future that not only addresses deals, it addresses how we invest in infrastructure, how we advance an equitable economy, how we focus on workforce development models, how we're driving innovation through the connectivity to capital and capital ecosystems. One of the partnerships we announced in Taiwan late last week was with Taiwan Island Startup Nation, which is really focused on this linkage between Asian entrepreneurs that are looking to invest in the U.S. We have a number of tools and locations where these foreign companies can come here and launch, and ultimately to internationalize our market. So I could spend more time on that if you'd like, but ultimately that's what my focus is all about, expanding the organizational and really leadership capacity of this region, and I'll continue to do that. So with that said, happy to tackle industries, tackle some of the challenges ahead, which I honestly think are opportunities, because this is one of the hottest markets in the United States. And I don't want anyone to take my comments as critical, but I'm that kind of guy. Like, I love to figure out where the gaps are in our competitive positioning and tackle them head on. I spent time with this new governor, the legislature, our senators, talking about all things chips. There's another cycle of chips manufacturing that I believe will take the next 4 years to work its way through the system. And then I would argue it's almost game over for chips, meaning the new projects are most likely going to be all determined in the next 4 years. There's going to still be supply chain to move with them, but then it's going to be all the adjacent sectors. So whether it's EV, quantum computing, certain ways that we embed chips into consumer products, as well as a new wave of environmental technology. So we're in all of those lanes. We were not there 15 years ago. We were pedal and distribution centers, warehouse logistics centers, data centers. It's an emphatically different economy, thanks to many of you at this table. So with that said, happy to pause there and answer any questions you might have.
But wait, before I ask, I said Jim brought up how we as colleagues could use our services. What are your thoughts on that, Chris? Is there something that you see out of this board or individuals on the board that we could be more helpful with growing Maricopa County in a great way?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so I'd give you 2 comments. First would be, I believe the county needs to maintain, I should say, its immense financial stewardship. I think that's critically important, almost above everything else you do, is that making sure that the county is as healthy as it can be financially, and that not other places are as strengthened as we are. So that's number one, making sure strong budgets, revenue, and expenses. Number 2, and I would go along the lines with what Jim mentioned. We are in an absolute race when it comes to competition against other markets, and those markets are Austin, Texas, Dallas, Charlotte, Atlanta. These other places have the continuity between the state, the region, and the city level, and it's really strategic planning. So when I think about it, it kind of touches on, Chairman, what I was referencing before. We need to deconstruct. This isn't just about business development. This is about the deconstruction of the next 20 years of the economy and looking at what inputs need to be addressed. And there are gaps in all of these areas, whether it's water planning, which we've done, I would argue, a very good job of, but we have to maintain that and continue our strategy on water planning. So, I go down each list, the workforce development, infrastructure planning, all of these elements. I'd love to see the county play a more significant role with GPEC, with Jim and others, with the IDA to say, okay, we have these dollars available. How do we put a strategic plan together on the future economy? We're creating roadmaps, but the challenge is it's so comprehensive. And I would argue the county could play a more influential role by being at the table, working with the business community and plugging into the state. But we're 75% of the state's economy. And so, and maybe this is just me being here as long as I have been, and I'm just like tired of, playing the game. I think the region should just lead. And we should be very vocal about the expectations of our market. And that's not just recruitment, it's not just infrastructure, it's the equitable economy aspects as well. And I think the county could play a much more active voice in that. And so I'd love to see that.
That's interesting you say, because no one looks at it that way. The foundational structural health financially of this county that we've been able to inherit by past leadership, but also continue on that way. It's hard to build a house like you're talking about without the structure and the foundation being in place. And there's 99% of the people out there do not still understand that this county carries no debt. And that's an unbelievable statistic. I think that so many communities would be so jealous of. And this is just the nature of our board, trying to figure out with a small spend how to be most effective with it. So thank you for mentioning that, because that is a barrier. We could blow the lid right off of property taxes and have a whole lot of money to spend on programs, but we've done this effectively to the point where we're at this great foundation. So thank you for mentioning that. I will look to my vice chairman. He wanted to ask a question. So
well, just a comment really. And I'll start by saying I'm not sure how many people realize what an effective organization we have at GPEC, the best in the country. We've done an outstanding job of attracting economic investment here, but I'm not sure people really appreciate what it takes. You know, when TSMC was looking to come into the United States, why did they pick Arizona? Well, part of that goes to the fact that we had established a relationship with Taiwan years ago. I'm proud that I played a role in that. I took a Little League team to play in Tainan, Taiwan 9 years ago. And the mayor in Tainan at that time that we became friends with is now the vice president of Taiwan. Those kind of things are very important in bringing foreign direct investment into our area.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Steve?
No, just thinking off the top of my head now, we talk about the Prop 400 and the whole extending our transportation efforts here, which is critical, and it is vital to the success of our economy and so on. But the one thing that was also tied to it, and I haven't heard any comments, was the rental tax and how that plays in the whole picture. I'm a strong believer. The stronger the cities, the stronger the county, the stronger the state. It really is. I mean, everyone has to be at their game, and we'll have a very strong state. But how does that play into the forecast of, because it hits the cities hard. I mean, I get the pro and con, okay, whatever. But it does. It's a big pill for a lot of these cities to take on. And it's not just a one-time hit. This is ongoing for a long time. I don't know what the municipalities plan on doing to make up, because they have to provide the services, the police, the fire. You know, they have to do all that good stuff. But any thoughts on that?
Supervisor Gardo, so that was ultimately the bargaining chip to get some of the Senate Republicans on board, it sounds like. And what I would say, I believe the last numbers I saw were roughly a $230 million impact to the communities. And I do think that was kind of the line drawn in the sand that if the lease tax is not given up, that 400 wouldn't be moved forward. And so with that said, I know cities are trying to figure out that loss. I was talking to the mayor of Tempe before this meeting started, and I know they have a pretty substantial hit. A lot of our cities have anywhere from a couple million to $80 million hit, I think it was, with City of Phoenix. So I think the challenge ultimately is significant amounts of those dollars were dedicated for public safety resources. With that said, the cities will have to go back and assess how they can find more resources. It goes back to what I said before, and I think this is for all elected officials to try to figure out together. We're entering a period in this economy where we want to be low cost, but lowest cost doesn't win in this next economy. Competitive costs will win. Competitive ability to invest in infrastructure will win. Ability to invest in the right workforce programs, not all of them, but the right ones are gonna matter. So, to me, I think the narrative needs to change, and I'm hoping we won't end up with this, massive tribalism going forward. But the reality is, we're competing with other places that are finding ways to get around the politics, state level down, to make investment strategies while making and we're enhancing the pro-business environment. Look what Texas is doing around adopting their own CHIPS Act. Colorado just announced a project yesterday around advanced manufacturing. These are things we were ultimately, besides Prop 400 and 2809, playing defense on. So I just think I'm hopeful our voice will continue to work with this administration, as I've shared. That wasn't the case even for me or GPEC 10 years ago. We weren't in those conversations, but we are today. So I'll continue to do what I can to, certainly, give feedback back to the county, to the cities, and make sure we're in the conversation. So it comes down to what the future economy needs and how we voice those.
Thank you. Before I look to my right, Bill Gates, do you have anything?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Chris, thanks so much for the presentation. Excellent as always. And, you made the comment about Maricopa County maintaining a strong fiscal position. And GPEC has been a part of that. You know, there's been an intentional effort by this board to outsource when that makes the most sense. You know, a lot of cities that we've been talking about, they have their own economic development departments, and that's absolutely fine and appropriate. But for Maricopa County to be able to frankly outsource it to you and your very strong team has led to great results. TSMC in my district being one of them, while being able to maintain a very strong bottom line in Maricopa County. So thanks for emphasizing that, and thanks for the big part that you're playing in that. Just one question. I'm curious if you were listening to Jim's comments about the job growth percentages, you know, our position, the position of Arizona, showing it being sort of middle of the road the last couple of years. Wondered if you had any comments on that, because it was a bit concerning to see those, but I certainly appreciated Jim's explanation for it.
Yeah, Supervisor Gates, so my wife has a shirt that says, it's fine, everything's fine. And that's what was popping in my head as you were asking that question. So, you know, I agree that there are other markets that had the late effect that, you know, particularly Nevada, which is much more tourism dominated, hospitality dominated, where they have much more significant swings and then have recoveries like what we saw reflected in Jim's statistics. I'm very optimistic about where we stand. I probably haven't been this optimistic about our economic diversity and position in all my years in Arizona. So I think it's going to be different, where explosive growth is going to feel different. I think we're going to have modest growth for the near term. And if there is a downturn, again, because I think the quantitative tightening that's occurring, no question that the level of money supply is going to be curbed. And, you know, we were like drunken sailors with so much liquidity. We as the country, not me, but we as the country. And that's going to burn itself off. And then it'll go back to, I believe, steady growth. And again, when I look at the health and wellness of our healthcare sector, our advanced manufacturing base, our construction sector, I agree that the curb is going to feel like almost like a rationalizing level of, or normalizing of the economic picture. So I feel positive about where we are and where we're going. Supervisor Gates.
Thank you.
Okay, Tom.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Chris, thank you for that presentation. You know, there's a lot of issues that I'm interested in, like workforce, other issues I'm concerned about, like zoning reform, EPA regulations, but I want to talk to you about water. But I want to bifurcate the question about water. And to me, water in many ways in Arizona is a perception issue. And I would like to get your take on how people perceive Arizona from the outside when you talk to prospective employers who are thinking about coming here, how you talk to them about the water situation, but also how people here in Arizona see our water situation. Because I think 10 or 12 years ago, if there was an announcement about $1 billion investment, people would be very excited. They would go rah, rah. But now today they might go, wait a minute, do we have the water? So please walk me through how you have to kind of do that balancing act, but answer the questions both on the outside and here inside the state.
Supervisor Galvin. All right, you brought up water. Okay, this is, usually I take like 45 minutes. I'm going to do this as quick as I can. So out of market, any kind of manufacturing user, their initial conversation with us starts with a very defensive position, meaning we don't think you have enough water. We've read what the New York Times has posted. We've read what you named the publication. And so the reality is, what we have to address that we didn't have to address 10 years ago was the reality of our historical water position, which, you know, dates back well before all of us were alive, and dating back the Hohokams and their building of canals. Again, I won't bore you with a whole timeline, but fast forward to the 1980 Water Management Plan, which was a very significant pinnacle time for us. There's only a few states in the entire union that have 100-year assured water supply requirements. So that's what's, you know, if you follow the reports out of the governor's office from the previous few months, that's what spiked this once again. The report said that we have a 4% shortage projected by 3023, 100 years from now. And in addition to that, it's roughly a 49,000 acre foot deficit. Okay, so all that being said, you know, I get the question then, well, why are we inviting a TSMC? Why are we inviting an Intel to expand, et cetera? these semiconductor manufacturing facilities recycle 90+%, and in some cases are net zero water users, meaning they remit more of their water back cleaner than what they receive it. And so, and even in Intel's case, they've done a number of wetland augmentation projects where they're net zero plus. I don't know what that term is, net zero plus, meaning they're giving more water back to the state of Arizona than what they're utilizing. So what I try to do is give factual information. We're using 1957 water levels today. Majority of our water utilization in our state is still agricultural use. That does not mean we should go take agriculture's water either. There's a balance to our growth. I think where most of our market, back to that report, was hit hardest was the town of, or the city of Buckeye and the town of Queen Creek, the non-designated cities. They both have approved plats with assured water supply. There are some without. Those without have to find ample more or additional water supplies. They will work through that. So unfortunately, the headlines read doom and gloom, and this place is unsustainable. I mean, I've addressed them all. I've met with them all. And unfortunately, the reality is there's going to be another story and another story. So we've created all of these tools. Our most recent one's called the DRIP campaign, where the DRIP is all about water facts and trying to get the reporters that are covering water back to a factual position. Again, not to say that we don't have to be good stewards of water. We absolutely do. We need to conserve. We need to use wisely. But unfortunately, the narrative out there is not as positive because it's sensationalized, drives more clicks. So that's reality we live in.
Exactly. Thank you. And I share those sentiments. And Mr. Chairman, the point I want to make is that, we discussed today about what policymakers can do, including the policymakers sitting here at this table. I think on the issue of water, it requires and it's incumbent upon us to show leadership. I think policymakers have to be very careful about what they say because things can be interpreted the wrong way. You cannot control what is a headline on the New York Times and the Washington Post, and we have to remember and be cognizant of the fact that people read these headlines not just around the state, but around the country, but around the world. And so a story that can be false or misleading can be read in Paris, can be read in London, can be read in Hong Kong, can be read in Tokyo, can be read in Australia. So we have to be very careful. It's incumbent upon us as policymakers and leaders to make sure that we get the message out correctly so we don't make jobs for you more difficult. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Again, we're going to wrap that up. Chris, thank you very much for coming and addressing the board, and especially Mr. Rounds. Thank you guys for coming. It is very important to this board of business people and the Maricopa County to have you come and speak to us and let us know, what's going on the internet. It's vitally important as we frame up decisions for the next year, especially when it comes to fiscal policy and what spaces we operate in, and what other spaces that we just need to take a little bit of a backseat on, but keep the ear open and to address things like that about how we need to be extremely careful with what we say and come at it from a very educated. We are marketers at our core. We are people that we want the right resident to come here and get great jobs, but we also want our residents to stay here and amass wealth, pay their taxes, and have a great life here for their families. So, all right. With that, thank you guys for joining us, and we'll move on to the next item.
Appreciate it.
Okay. We are now going to go to item number 4, and I guess do I get to ask Cindy to come up, or are we just going to go blow and go? All right. Item number 4, which is an action item, is the request for cash deficit school district levy. Are there any questions from the supervisors about this item? If not, we will now consider item number 4. Is there a motion regarding this item?
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of agenda item number 4.
Second.
All right, great. I have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. We will now consider item number 5, which is a request for judgment and resolution school district levies. Is there a motion regarding this item?
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of agenda item number 5.
Second.
Thank you. I have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. We will now consider the adoption of the FY 2024 property tax levy resolution. Do any of the supervisors have any questions or comments? Is there a motion for item number 6, the FY 2024 property tax levy resolution?
Mr. Chairman,
Jack?
I move that we adopt the fiscal year 2024 property tax levy resolution as printed in the agenda, which sets the fiscal year 2024 tax year 2023 primary and/or secondary tax rates for Maricopa County, the Flood Control District of Maricopa County, Maricopa County Library District, and the County Improvement Districts. Pursuant to the direction of each governmental entity, levy the amounts of taxes and set the resulting tax rates for each as set forth in number 2 of the Maricopa County fiscal year 2024, tax year 2023, tax levy resolution. In addition, direct the treasurer to collect the taxes as detailed in number 3 of this agenda item.
Great, thank you, Jack. Is there a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Thank you, Bill. Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. Item number 7 is the adoption of the full cash value for bond calculation. Do I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of item number 7.
Great, thank you, Jack. Do I have a second?
Second.
Great, thank you, Tom. I have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. And before we move on to adjournment, I want to thank everybody for working so hard to get us to this point. It seems awfully ministerial, but it is definitely a source of hard work. I want to also introduce Eddie Cook is here today, and the assessor's office, and his chief, Don Marie. So thank you guys for attending and working hard towards this. Valuations are awfully important to get us to this point about setting the tax levy. So thank you guys for your hard work, and the treasurer as well, as he gets ready to send off the notices. So with that, we will now adjourn this meeting and reconvene in executive session in the Sullivan Conference Room. Thank you, Tom.